In our story, we will explore this change together, that is, the history of war strategies. War, humanity's darkest reflection, yet also the arena of its brightest minds. Since the dawn of time, humanity has used conflict both as a survival instinct and as a means of establishing order. According to scientists, over 2,000 deadly clashes have occurred in just the last 500 years. Considering our thousands of years of history, this statistic reveals how painful and definitive a reality war is. From the first hunting scenes carved into cave walls, to the shadow of Spartan spears, from the armored divisions of World War II, to today's military software and satellite-controlled battlefronts, this journey has seen not only weapons change, but also our way of thinking. It has often been the sharpness of ideas and objectives rather than the power of weapons that has determined the victor. The most concrete manifestation of this sharpness was war strategies. History is full of victory stories written not so much by numerically superior armies as by cleverly thinking and planning commanders. It makes perfect sense that the origin of the word is the Greek strategia, meaning the knowledge of managing an army. Yes, war is an act of killing, but it has always been a balancing act between strategy, psychology, and ideology. In every era, the level of society and technology created its own weapons and war strategies. Spears and esprit de corps in ancient times, heavily armored cavalry and faith in the Middle Ages, and unmanned systems and propaganda in our era. The Mongols' 100,000-strong cavalry units covered thousands of kilometers as swiftly as the wind. The Roman legions built and protected a vast empire with their discipline and logistical superiority. During the Cold War, strategies were defined by keeping fingers on the nuclear trigger. Today, the front lines are expanding with cyberattacks, artificial intelligence-powered weapon systems, and hybrid warfare. Sun Tzu, perhaps one of the two greatest masters of the art of war in history, said, "If you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." While the other master, Clausewitz, wrote, "War is merely the continuation of policy by other means." The 2,000-year bridge between these two statements reminds us that wars are won not only on the battlefield, but first and foremost in the mind. This narrative is about the story of the minds. Tolstoy, the great novelist who also served on the battlefield, deeply questioned both the human spirit and war in his work War and Peace, in which he said, "How can a theory and a science be supposed to exist under unknown conditions and circumstances? And when the forces brought into play can never be accurately determined? Can anyone guess what the relative position of our army and the enemy will be 24 hours hence? Perhaps the entire history of warfare is an answer to this difficult question." Our aim is not only to provide information about the technical aspects of war while seeking an answer to this question. We will also try to explain the turning points in war strategies and how they are intertwined with our history. Why did the first human communities start fighting? How did a hunting ambush transform into the first form of a deadly strategy? The answer lies in our ancestors' survival instinct and their ability to turn fear into reason. As a creature without claws or teeth, but with the ability to think, humans learned to make plans to survive. During the Paleolithic era, hunters tracked animal migration routes, observed wind direction, and identified ambush points. When a small but organized group of humans surrounded a herd of mammoths and trapped them, it was the first victory of planning. As Yuval Noah Harari says in *Sapiens*, what set us apart from other species was our ability to use our imagination collectively and strategy was precisely a product of this uniqueness. Over time, hunting gave way to conflict. As climates changed and resources dwindled, tribes clashed with one another. War was a continuation of hunting, but now the targets were not animals, but other human communities. Archaeological findings show the existence of deliberate traps and traces of planned attacks targeting humans from as early as 12,000 years ago. The 10,000-year-old skeletons found at Natarok in Kenya bear the traces of one of history's first organized attacks, a planned ambush and systematic execution. As the hunting team transformed into a war unit, the first leaders emerged, people who were strong and capable of thinking. The chain of command, organization, tactics, and discipline took root in their most primitive form during this phase. War also began to generate knowledge. Just as hunters learned to read animal tracks, warriors learned to read the enemy's intentions. The direction of smoke, the flight of birds, the depth of footprints, each of these was intelligence. The foundations of modern intelligence lie in these intuitive observations. With the agricultural revolution in the Neolithic period, people settled down, and land, production, and property emerged, which needed to be protected. Thus, war became a social institution. Villages were surrounded by moats for defense, watchmen were posted, and castles were built. Military thinking became a natural part of social organization. In Mesopotamia, the fact that the king's palace and his army were within the same walls shows that power was centralized, and strategy became the state's mind. The stratagems mentioned in Assyrian tablets summarize the oldest principles of the art of war: deception, secrecy, timing. Tel Leilan tablets from the Mesopotamian civilizations, dating back 3,000 years, mention sending spies and messengers to enemy territory in preparation for war. As these examples show, humans ceased to be an ordinary part of nature and became beings who made plans against nature and their own species. And there has never been any turning back from this point. Strategy was essentially born as the art of thinking to survive. And over the millennia, a new era began, reaching to the masters of antiquity, who turned it into a matter of wisdom. Thus, we arrive at the lands of China and Greece, to the time of Sun Tzu and Thucydides. The ancient era was a time when wars were fought with logic and patience as much as with swords and shields. The wars of this era were a testing ground for the development of strategy. War, previously seen as the game of the gods, was now becoming a struggle governed by human intellect. In the East, the Chinese sage Sun Tzu, in his work The Art of War, explains the essence of war in one sentence: all warfare is based on deception. This was primarily a psychological analysis of human nature. According to Sun Tzu, the supreme commander is the one who wins without fighting, because it is the commander's mind, rather than the physical clash of armies, that determines the outcome of war. With his idea, the battlefield was transferred to the inner world of people: morale, patience, deception, intelligence. In ancient China, spies spread false information to panic enemy armies. Disinformation was the first version of today's cyber warfare. Meanwhile, in the Greek world, Thucydides, with his History of the Peloponnesian War, brought strategy into the realm of politics and psychology. According to him, the struggle between Athens and Sparta had progressed entirely on the axis of fear, honor, and interest, independent of divine will. This was the first time war was analyzed on a rational basis, and in this respect it was a turning point. In these wars, Athens' weakening of the Spartans through economic embargo and naval power demonstrated the importance of logistics and diplomacy. Psychological pressure, the alliance dynamics, and timing were forces that determined the outcome, even in those ancient times. It is certainly no coincidence that NATO officers' training includes an examination of Thucydides' analyses from the perspective of human nature and the psychology of war. Ancient Greece approached military matters on a rational basis. The phalanx formation of the hoplites, or heavily armored infantry, was the military embodiment of mathematical perfection. The power of unity came more from the harmony of collective movement than from individual courage. The wars against the Persian invasion demonstrated the importance of maneuver and deception. The Thermopylae resistance, which stopped the Persian army consisting of tens of thousands of soldiers in 480 BC, was the result of the phalanx system, as well as the tremendous courage of 300 Spartan warriors. When discussing ancient warfare strategies, it is difficult not to mention Alexander the Great. He took the Macedonian phalanx tradition he inherited from his ancestors to a whole new level. By combining the use of forces, flexible maneuvers, long-range campaign planning, and psychological warfare, he developed a multi-layered strategic mindset. With this approach, which ranged from cultural integration to politics, he became both a conqueror of the ancient world and one of the pioneers of modern strategic thinking. Alexander's combined force structure, cavalry center coordination, and strategic logistical organization influenced the formation of the Roman legion system. Roman generals, especially Julius Caesar, modeled their campaigns on Alexander's, both tactically and strategically. It should be noted that Alexander the Great, by spreading Hellenistic culture and transforming military thought, created both a mental and strategic bridge between the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. In the ancient world, war was a subject as much for philosophers as it was for generals. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle debated the moral aspects of war, giving rise to the idea of just war. In China, Confucian thought taught that war should be limited by order and morality. It could be said that at that time, the East considered military planning an intuitive and spiritual art, while the West sought to understand it on a rational basis. This difference shaped the two worlds' thinking about war for centuries, but ultimately, both traditions would arrive at the same conclusion. Victory springs from knowledge, not sheer power. Created as an art of wisdom and deception, strategy became a social discipline in the ancient world. But even when we look back thousands of years later, the question still arises in our minds. Did wisdom really prevent war, or did it simply make it more sophisticated? Yes, the wise commanders of the ancient world had defined strategy with the mind, but humanity understood that other qualities were also necessary to win: order and organization. This understanding takes us from the Greek hoplites to the legions of Rome, that is, to the triumph of discipline. Is it courage or discipline that makes an army invincible? The ancient Greek and Roman worlds gave two different answers to this question. For the Greeks, war was initially a stage for individual heroism. The ideal of individual bravery in Homer's epics gradually gave way to the collective order of the phalanx. The hoplites were citizen soldiers who fought in close formation, locked shield to shield. Each soldier protected his comrade on his right with his shield, and as long as the chain remained unbroken, the enemy was defeated and the city-state survived. This was the military form of democracy. The citizen fought for the city, and the city fought for the citizen. The structure was like an imposing wall, moving as the soldiers interlocked with each other. Therefore, its maneuverability was limited and it lacked flexibility, easily dispersing on rough terrain. It was this weakness that paved the way for Rome's military doctrine. Then, Rome introduced a new definition of strategy, the legion system. This new order transformed the phalanx's monolithic, wall-like structure into a modular one. Each unit could move independently, and when necessary, act as a unified army. This flexibility gave Rome superiority in wars beyond its borders, paving the way from a city-state to an empire. The legion was one of the most resilient and flexible organizations in military history. Its success stemmed from its systematic nature rather than heroism. Legions were regular, mobile units, each consisting of approximately 5,000 soldiers. The chain of command was clear, and every soldier knew his duty down to the last detail. Roman soldiers were taught a strict order called disciplina, and disobedience was punished by death. However, this strictness also produced miraculous efficiency. Armies marched 30 kilometers every day and built a small fortress with their own hands every evening. This was both a defensive measure and a form of willpower. The fact that the Roman Empire had an army of approximately 500,000 soldiers in the world of 2,000 years ago is a result of their military systems that still amazes us today. For an empire whose main principle was si vis pacem, para bellum, meaning if you want peace, prepare for war, it was probably impossible to think otherwise. Roman armies were also masters of logistics. The road network, supply points, and pass control were all part of a strategic imperial plan. As the empire grew, roads, ports, and castles became the arteries of the military system. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," was actually a concise expression of a political military plan. The empire also took post-war processes into account. Post-conquest integration, public relations, and control of local powers were part of the strategic plan. This shows us that war was not limited to the front lines, but that politics, culture, logistics, and propaganda tools were also intertwined with military thinking. In summary, the lesson that the ancient world's understanding of strategy leaves us is clear. Victory comes from order, discipline, and organization. This approach has also become ingrained in the spirit of modern armies. In the centuries following the fall of Rome's slave-based order, the stone castles of seigneurs and lords began to rise. Now, catapults, knights, and a harsh wind rising from the east are on the stage of history. A new era is beginning. From long sieges to the Crusades and the Mongols, the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, strategy was surrounded by castle walls. But intellect and technology began to overcome these walls at a pace as slow as the age itself. While the West developed a tradition of warfare built on chivalry and honor, the East put engineering and intelligence at the service of war. Castles, which became widespread in Europe from the 9th century onwards, were symbols of both the military system and the feudal order. Lords, knights, and serfs lived in the shadow of these structures, and wars were shaped by long sieges. While catapults and battering rams ravaged the castles, the defenders resisted with boiling oil, moats, and archers. However, the Western ideal of honorable warfare often turned into strategic blindness. The Crusades were the most striking example of this. Brave but undisciplined Western armies were crushed by the rational Islamic military mind. During this period, particularly in the 9th century, the Islamic world had turned strategy into a rational science. Khalid ibn al-Walid's flexible maneuvers against the Byzantines, Saladin's tactics that established psychological superiority over the Crusader armies, and engineering works that were quite advanced for the time are expressions of this reality. Muslim engineers wrote in detail about the structure of catapults, the use of incendiary materials, and defense planning, adding a new dimension to medieval warfare with siege towers and tunnels. These works are among the first examples of military engineering becoming institutionalized in the historical sense. Analyses on the Islamic states of that period show that military understanding included tactical elements, as well as management, planning, logistics, ethical rules, and psychological warfare. Between the 11th and 13th centuries in Europe, battles were characterized by knightly tactics, shock attacks by cavalry, heavily armored knights, and mounted archers were prominent. However, this understanding was slowly beginning to change. Warfare in Europe was gradually becoming institutionalized. The mercenary army leaders known as condottieri, who emerged in the Italian city-states in the 14th century, were the first examples of professional command. These were not noble knights, but commanders who acted with strategic skill. At the same time, the English longbow revolutionized the battlefield. In the 100 Years' War, which began in 1337, England repeatedly defeated France, which had larger armies. The victories at Crécy and Agincourt in particular demonstrated how technological innovations, namely the use of the longbow, tactical mastery, and moral superiority, could overturn the classical understanding of physical strength. In these wars, Western commanders adopted methods such as using disciplined longbow infantry units to break the enemy's defensive advantages, gathering local intelligence through spies, and cutting supply lines. In the 13th century, a storm blew in from the east, the Mongols. Contrary to popular belief, their success stemmed not from their ruthlessness, but from their communication and organizational skills. Their mounted postal system, called the Yam, was a pioneering military communication network connecting hundreds of kilometers of front lines. The Mongols essentially viewed the battlefield as a chessboard, and each ambush was a calculated move on that board. This mindset laid the foundations for the concept of deception warfare centuries later. Tactics such as luring the enemy into a trap using feigned retreats were precursors to modern maneuver and information warfare doctrines. And so we come to the end of the Middle Ages. With the arrival of gunpowder in Europe, feudal castles began to lose their significance. The science-based engineering of the Islamic world combined with the mechanical experimentation of the West, changing the language of war. With gunpowder began the era of cannon fire, compasses, and maps. Humanity entered the age of the Renaissance and gunpowder. Could a single grain of gunpowder change 1,000 years of warfare? The Renaissance, an era marked by the rise of humanism and culture, was ironically also a rebirth of war and strategy. Medieval military thinking was swept into history by the roar of gunpowder. This chemical mixture, which reached Europe from China and the Middle East in the 14th century, was a total revolution in the art of war. The destructive power of gunpowder was also one of the factors that paved the way for the collapse of feudalism. So it's no exaggeration to say that it influenced world political history. With gunpowder, the architecture of warfare changed fundamentally. War was now a mathematical equation, determined by cannons that destroyed castle walls, range, and rate of fire. Italian city-states such as Florence, Venice, and Milan, pioneers of the Renaissance, also pioneered artillery. Leonardo da Vinci designed not only offensive weapons but also ideal defensive walls in his sketchbooks. It is astonishing to learn that this unique genius designed a giant armored tank with a circular shape and cannons almost 600 years ago. In essence, warfare was becoming an engineering art. High castles were being replaced by low, thick-walled star forts. This new type of structure was resistant to cannon fire and also provided fire superiority in all directions. The Palmanova fortress in Italy represents the military aesthetics of the period with its geometric perfection. Even urban planning took on a military dimension. Renaissance engineers and mathematicians turned the battlefield into a laboratory. Along with strategy, armies were also changing. Instead of static defense, dynamic attack became the norm. Knights were replaced by highly disciplined infantry armed with cannons and rifles. The Spanish tercio units, consisting of spearmen, musketeers, and swordsmen, were modular, in other words, mobile and flexible, heralding the advent of modern armies. War, previously a means of gaining glory and fame, became the arena of discipline, technique, and professional soldiers. On the other hand, the darkest side of Renaissance warfare was the mercenary system. In these armies, loyalty was measured in gold. This severed the military system from morality and obedience from ideology. Nevertheless, this trend toward professionalization would form the basis of future armies. A new era had also begun at sea. With the mounting of cannons on ships, firepower became as important as maneuverability in naval warfare. The solid iron cannonballs used during France's Italian campaign in 1494 changed the political balance of the continent. From that moment on, the concept of firepower became the language of international relations. As the cost of war increased, it became apparent that only powerful states could maintain large armies. War was primarily an economic issue. Weapons production, logistics, and taxation became strategic elements. This would give rise to centralized monarchies and even the nation-states of the future. Machiavelli's idea that a prince without weapons could never be secure defined the relationship between politics and war, and summed up the spirit of the time. Gunpowder, not divine will, was seen as the source of power. With the Renaissance, the scientific aspect of warfare came to the fore. Maps, topography, geometry, and engineering were the new weapons of strategy. The foundations of military academies were also laid during this period. As the nature of land warfare underwent a definitive change, human eyes turned to the horizon. We are approaching a turning point. Now is the time to win victories on the waves as well. Times when sails are filled with wind, the struggle for dominance of the seas extending from Salamis to Mahan. The stage for strategy was not simply confined to land. It was time for the seas to become part of the struggle. Whoever rules the waves rules the world. This ancient idea was systematized in the 19th century by the American naval officer and theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan. According to Mahan, a nation's naval power was determined by its geographical location, commercial vitality, seafaring tradition, and the continuity of its navy. In other words, The sea was not only a battlefield, but also a strategic axis where trade, politics, and culture converged. Mahan's views continued to influence the period from the British Empire to the United States' global hegemony policy. But to understand the spirit of the struggle at sea, we must go back much further, to the Gulf of Salamis. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BC between the Persian navy and the Greek city-states is known as the first great victory of naval strategy in history. The Greek commander, Themistocles, lured the numerically superior Persian fleet into a narrow strait, eliminating his enemy's maneuverability. This result was a product of intelligence, geographical knowledge, and patience. In the Middle Ages, maritime republics such as Venice and Genoa combined this tradition with trade. Every Venetian ship was both a fortress and an economic center. The Ottomans, meanwhile, turned the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake thanks to Barbarossa Hayreddin Pasha. In 1538, at Preveze, the half-moon tactic was used, with wind, maneuvering, and cannon fire employed in such a synchronized manner for the first time. On the one hand, the military orientation at sea combined line battles, blockades, and piracy. Naval blockade became one of the most effective ways to defeat the enemy without fighting. Espionage and diplomacy were also part of the conflict. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Spain and Portugal in the west transformed the oceans into maps of their empires. The exploration routes of the Atlantic Ocean carried the gold of the New World to Europe. Then the Dutch, known as the Porters of the Seas, transformed their merchant fleet into a weapon in the 17th century, ushering in an era of conquest through maritime trade. In 1588, Spain's Invincible Armada, which set sail to invade England, was shattered by the agile English navy and its clever tactics. This defeat marked the beginning of England's rise at sea, symbolizing Spain's decline and the dawn of the modern era of naval power. In the 17th and 18th centuries, naval power became one of the factors determining the fate of empires. Those who possessed naval power also controlled trade, exploration, and colonies. England's rise was primarily based on the strength of its navy. The English maximized their firepower and durability. This led to the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. The British Navy, under Admiral Nelson, inflicted a crushing defeat on the combined French-Spanish fleet, losing almost no ships. This victory paved the way for Britain's dominance of the world's oceans for the rest of the century. This superiority was one of the main factors that enabled Britain to become a power ruling over approximately 1/4 of the world's landmass in the 19th century. In essence, naval supremacy meant the colonization of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Another dimension of the struggle at sea was logistics. A navy had to be fed, repaired, and protected. For this reason, overseas empires wove a global network of naval bases and trading ports. Crete, Malta, Singapore, Gibraltar, all were strategic points. The global network of bases and ports is the infrastructure of world domination, today as it was yesterday. In the 19th century, Mahan's theories offered rising powers such as the US and Japan a new vision. Control maritime trade, manage the global economy. This perspective was influential from the Pacific Front in World War II to the Cold War's underwater nuclear submarine competition. The depths of the seas also became a playground for military planning. Naval power remains the backbone of global strategy. The fiber optic cables, oil pipelines, and trade routes beneath the oceans are all invisible battlegrounds for today's maritime empires. In the 21st century, naval supremacy has become dependent on digital and intelligence data and the logistics chain. On the other hand, aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, and highly maneuverable destroyer fleets continue to be instruments of global power. Ships built empires. Trade routes shaped the world. But at this point, we encounter a great revolution that transcends the seas. Industry. With the power of steam, strategy also changes. Clausewitz, Jomini, and the scientific spirit of war lead the way. By the late 18th century, the world was undergoing a fundamental transformation. The concept of governance was evolving from the will of kings to the power of ideas and industry. The power of steam, the hardness of steel, and the explosiveness of ideas were fundamentally changing the dynamics of war. The Industrial Revolution not only gave rise to huge factories, but also transformed armies. Locomotives transported soldiers to the front in hours, not weeks, and the telegraph provided commanders with rapid communication that had once been impossible. Courage was still essential, but the art of war now measured speed and coordination. At this juncture of the story, in this section on the effects of the Industrial Revolution, let's pause and briefly summarize the relationship between war strategies and the level of technology and production. Throughout history, technological progress has been a decisive force that has constantly reshaped the nature of warfare, and it continues to do so. Technical advances in production, transportation, and communication transformed weapons, the structure of armies, military thinking, and the tempo of warfare. This observation is, in fact, broadly valid for every period of history. The rendering of medieval castles obsolete by gunpowder, the invention of the rifle and the increasing accuracy of firearms becoming a strategic factor, the contribution of advances in artillery to Napoleon's mobile strategy, the Industrial Revolution determining war capacity for 2 centuries, and today's advanced technologies changing the nature of warfare are striking examples of this process. From the mid-20th century onwards, the invention of cheap, durable, and easy-to-use light rifles, particularly the Kalashnikov, and their mass production, which made them affordable and widespread, enabling small groups to gain effectiveness against powerful states through guerrilla methods, is another remarkable proof of this reality. Ultimately, warfare evolved alongside the level of social production. As technology advanced, strategy took on a more planned, measurable, and systematic character. Yes, let's continue with the French Revolution, which transformed the world along with the Industrial Revolution. The two main developments that left their mark on the military understanding of this period were the Napoleonic Wars and mass mobilization. For 2 centuries before the Revolution, the 17th and 18th centuries, the concept of line battle prevailed in Europe. Line battle was a concept of warfare in which infantrymen lined up in long, tight lines and fought using collective and disciplined volley fire. Napoleon introduced mobile, tactical, and operational principles that would render the static, line-based form of battle obsolete. Technological and organizational developments in the following years accelerated this transformation. Another fundamental innovation brought about by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars was mass mobilization, which meant that Europe was witnessing the mobilization of nations instead of the challenges of aristocratic commanders. A nation could direct all its energy toward a single military objective. War had become the domain not only of generals, but also of engineers, economists, and bureaucrats. strategy became synonymous with the concept of operational planning. The maneuverability of armies and the continuity of supply became vitally important. One of the most impressive examples of how wars now belonged to nations, unlike in the past, was the Battle of Valmy in 1792. In this battle between France's revolutionary armies and the feudal kingdoms of Europe, French commander Kellerman raised his hat and shouted, "Vive la nation," meaning, "Long live the nation," as he advanced on the enemy army. Goethe, who witnessed the battle, wrote in his notes, "From this day forth begins a new era in the history of the world." The two pioneering military figures of this intellectual revolution were Clausewitz and Jomini. One of the most famous quotes from Clausewitz, a Prussian officer who fought against Napoleon and was taken prisoner, was, as we mentioned at the beginning, "War is merely the continuation of policy by other means." This sentence became the cornerstone of modern military thought. According to him, war was an extension of states' political objectives. Clausewitz also defined the nature of war through uncertainty. What he meant by this was the human dimension of war. Even a perfect plan could be disrupted by a simple intelligence error, a communication delay, or a misinterpretation. One of the most well-known examples is the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, which was prepared with extraordinary meticulousness over a period of 10 years by the German General Staff, due to the incompetence of the officers who commanded the operations in World War I. The concept of friction, based on this reality, namely the fact that war plans are constantly disrupted in the field, was one of his most original contributions to war theory. It is certain that this idea resonated in the minds of all the leading commanders of the 20th century. Eisenhower, Zhukov, Rommel, all had to learn the art of managing friction. Jomini, on the other hand, sought the order of war in mathematics. He transformed the lines of armies, the angles of fronts, and supply routes into a geometry problem. His models of the perfect war on the map corresponded to the mechanical understanding of the industrial order. Clausewitz's philosophy, which emphasized complexity, and Jomini's systematic understanding, became the two poles of modern military thought. From Prussia's Kriegsakademie to West Point in the United States, military academies synthesized the strategic concepts of these two great thinkers. The Industrial Revolution gave concrete form to these theories. War proceeded at the pace of steam-powered machines, railroads, and factories. The concept of maneuver warfare, inherited from Napoleon, gradually transformed into mechanical warfare during this period. The range of artillery increased, and firepower planning was based on scientific calculations. Military engineering merged with geometry, and maps became the language of war. By the end of the 19th century, the military system was measured by national industrial capacity. The front line began in factories. This was the stage when war strategies shifted from intuition to analysis, from glory and fame to systematic thinking. As the wheels of the Industrial Revolution continued to turn, nations grew, states strengthened, ideologies clashed, and eventually, the world was set ablaze. All experiences and theories now faced a new test: the destruction wrought by the world wars, air power, and nuclear strategy. The 20th century, as historian Eric Hobsbawm put it, was an age of extremes, the peak and simultaneous decline of human intelligence. This century saw wars fought not only by armies, but also by factories, laboratories, propaganda, and ideologies. This era pushed the boundaries of war both physically and morally. The armored trains, machine guns, tanks, aircraft, chemical gases, and, most importantly, the armies of millions of soldiers in World War I, which began in 1914 and lasted 4 years, made Clausewitz's concept of friction visible on every front. No plan remained intact when put into practice. Along the 700-kilometer-long trenches stretching across the Western Front, or in other words, the mud line, resilience won out. The industrial and economic capacities of the warring powers, and consequently their logistics, intelligence, and morale management, often took precedence over firepower. World War I saw the emergence of the concept of total war, meaning that every member of the nation was part of war effort. Women produced bullets in factories, economies became massive mechanisms serving the front, and cities were bombed. The front line was now everywhere. Weapons appeared in the sky for the first time. Planes were used first for reconnaissance, then for bombing. The Second World War, which began in 1939, was technologically and strategically much more complex than the first. Tanks were now the heart of armies, and air power had a significant impact on the course of war. Germany's Blitzkrieg, or lightning war doctrine, was based on speed, air-ground coordination, and shock effect. Instead of the static trenches of the First World War, a mobile form of warfare emerged. Warplanes cleared the way for ground troops, and radio communication provided armies with instant coordination. This method brought about the fall of Poland, France, and many other countries within weeks against the Nazi army. But ultimately, Hitler's apparatus of invasion and destruction collapsed in the face of the Red Army's relentless resistance and Anglo-American air power. What defeated the Nazis was, in addition to their own strategic mistakes, primarily the industrial power and inexhaustible human resources of their enemies. By the mid-1940s, the skies had become the new front in war. Thousands of transport, bomber, and fighter planes clashed in the air. The Pacific Front was the testing ground for sea-air integration. The attack on Pearl Harbor was an ambitious military move by Japan, but the Battle of Midway in 1942 demonstrated how air power had taken over naval supremacy. In a 6-minute skirmish at Midway, U.S. warplanes sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, changing the fate of the Pacific. This event is considered the moment when Mahan's theory of naval power evolved into the air age. In the years that followed, the concept of air power developed further. Italian thinker Duhay's assertion that he who controls the air controls the world became a cornerstone of post-World War II NATO doctrine. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Middle East to Kosovo, in every major conflict, air superiority was seen to have a significant impact on the final outcome. Meanwhile, the Enigma code used by the German command was cracked by the British. This was a strategic move that was perhaps equivalent to the impact of tanks on the battlefield. This allowed the Allies to anticipate the enemy's moves and gain superiority on the invisible front of the war. After World War II, this invisible war would evolve into the intelligence competition of the Cold War and the data wars of the cyber age. In the modern era, war was waged based on intelligence and information. In 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented the point where strategy collided with morality. The first use of the atomic bomb turned the idea of absolute victory into a shame for humanity. Throughout the Cold War, nuclear balance was established through the concept of mutual assured destruction. Thus, the concept of deterrence was born. The way to prevent war was to make it impossible. With the advances in military technology in the second half of the century, missile defense systems, radar networks, and nuclear submarines became the shields of war. Satellites, surveillance systems, and remote-controlled weapons transformed the battlefield into a data network. War ultimately evolved into a global chessboard, with industrial production, psychological warfare, and information superiority as the pieces. However, the most painful lesson of the 20th century was probably this: our minds can perfect the science of warfare, but they can never make it innocent. Because war still begins with the dark side of humanity. The story does not end here. While the cold balance of nuclear danger persists, war is changing form once again. Now, codes speak as loudly as bullets. We are entering the new battlefields of the 21st century. That is, today's world. A world of cyber, hybrid, and artificial intelligence warfare. As we entered the 21st century, the face of war changed. Today, the enemy may not always be a soldier in uniform. The front lines have expanded from topographical maps to digital networks. Data flows and algorithms are as vital as tanks and artillery, and victory depends as much on cognitive and technological superiority as it does on traditional military power. In the age of cyber warfare, battlefronts are established using keyboards. The 2007 cyber attacks on Estonia paralyzed the country for several days. This event marked a turning point in NATO history, with cyberspace officially being declared the fifth front of war, alongside land, sea, air, and space. In 2010, Stuxnet targeted Iran's Natanz nuclear facilities and demonstrated that it was possible to strike nuclear programs with code, thereby reinforcing ideas about the effectiveness of cyber warfare. Such attacks can compromise military data, damage power grids and water systems, and even influence election results. Attacks from unknown sources complicate deterrence, making it risky to fight back without knowing who you are fighting. Digital platforms are another arena for cyber warfare. Misinformation disseminated deliberately on social media can affect public morale, election results, and even the direction of alliances. Today, dominance depends on shaping perceptions. Armies are therefore establishing Information Operations Units. The U.S. Cyber Command, China's Cyber Unit PLA Unit 61398, and Russia's Web Brigades are pioneers of this new type of warfare. The wars of the 21st century are mostly conducted in a hybrid form. This is a new generation of warfare that simultaneously employs conventional military forces, cyber attacks, disinformation, special forces, propaganda, economic pressure, and diplomatic maneuvers. In other words, it is a war waged in the realms of information, economics, and minds. Hybrid warfare is, in a sense, a gray area where the visible and the invisible intertwine. The pro-Russian Little Green Men that appeared in Crimea in 2014 are an example of this strategy, where ununiformed troops, disinformation, cyber attacks, economic sanctions, and local militia support were used together. Other known examples of hybrid warfare include the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, China's military activities in the South China Sea and around Taiwan, Iran's conflicts in the Middle East through proxy forces, and Turkey's operations in Syria and Libya. Perhaps the most effective elements of hybrid warfare are UAVs, UCAVs, and drones. States and armed groups can strike targets without sending troops, thereby reducing human casualties and political costs to some extent. Modern AI-powered drone systems can analyze millions of possibilities per second to quickly optimize target identification and operational decisions. These tools also function as sensors that provide intelligence and data superiority. Their high impact, despite low cost, enables even small political actors to challenge large armies. Space and infrastructure are also important fronts in warfare today. When fiber optic cables, GPS, and satellite networks are targeted, a country's communications and defense capabilities can be crippled in a short time. The U.S. Space Force, established in 2019, officially acknowledged this multi-layered approach to warfare by declaring space an operational dimension of war. Undoubtedly, as we move toward the middle of the 21st century, strategy is once again being redefined by science and technological advancement. Artificial intelligence can create war plans, perform target analysis, and even simulate war scenarios. The U.S. analyzes drone images in seconds with initiatives such as the Maven project. Israel's Harpy autonomous drones and the U.S.'s Sea Hunter ship can wage war without the need for human control. A machine's ability to learn and change its decision-making processes by learning from its mistakes makes military planning unpredictable, and scenarios in which artificial intelligences fight each other are being discussed. Additionally, missiles are a decisive force in modern strategy. As seen in the Iran-Israel conflicts, long-range ballistic and cruise missiles can change the course of war by targeting military installations and critical infrastructure. The conflict between Saudi Arabia and Yemen is another example. The hypersonic missile programs developed by the US and Russia demonstrate the level this race has reached. All of this underlines how missile capabilities are used as a deterrent and a means of strategic pressure. The history of strategy is, of course, a boundless sea. But let's slowly make our way to the end of the story. After discussing war and strategy this much, we believe the question that needs to be asked is, what have we learned from all these events? Clashes continue in many different forms in Ukraine, Sudan, Palestine, and many other regions. There also seems to be no obstacle, at least for now, to even larger wars occurring. It is impossible to say that wars are over in the 21st century. Our history is, in fact, a continuous evolution of intelligence and strategy. In this journey from stone axes to algorithms, from catapults to drones, only the means have changed. From the Trojan horse to the Stuxnet virus, every era has exalted the art of defeating the enemy with intelligence rather than force. Each era shaped its own warfare according to the level of development of society and the state of technology. In ancient times, courage was paramount. In the Middle Ages, faith. In the Renaissance, reason. In modern times, science. But at its core, strategy still seeks to answer the same question. How do we win? In this phase of history, strategy, like many concepts, is being redefined. Information has become the most powerful weapon. A hacker can be as powerful as an army. An artificial intelligence algorithm can make decisions faster than a general. Physical battlefields have merged with the virtual world, making it difficult to identify the enemy. But the essence of the art of war, that is, the need to anticipate, deceptively mislead, and manipulate, has never changed. Military thinking also tests our consciences. Because as genius is glorified, moral boundaries become blurred. Perhaps the ultimate goal of strategy is now not just to win, but to question the necessity of winning. The day we achieve this, the necessity of war will truly be questioned.